Hi, I'm Dr. Richard Scott Noakes, and this is the mini lecture for the Pillow Book of Seishonagon. Now, often students find the Pillow Book of Seishonagon a little bit confusing because it's not what they would normally think of being a story. In fact, it isn't really even what you consider a selection of poems. Instead, the Pillow Book is something that we call a miscellany. And what a miscellany is, as you might have gathered from its relationship to the word miscellaneous, is it's any group of various and diverse objects. Now, some miscellanies are something that an individual editor has gathered together from a variety of different sources and has put together to create a whole, or maybe to create a sense of sometimes of their own identity in journals or this sort of thing. In the case of the Pillow Book, it's a miscellany of thoughts and ideas, anecdotes, lists from one particular person, Seishonagon. Now, Seishonagon is a very interesting woman. She lived in 10th century Japan, and she happened to know Murasaki Shikibu, who wrote the Tale of Genji. In fact, they seem to know each other quite well, and they seem to not like each other at all. That being said, two of the greatest writers of Japanese literature both were writing at the same time and knew each other. Now, one thing that I think should note about Seishonagon is that the way she comes across in the Pillow Book is as not a very sympathetic figure. And that is not particularly surprising. It seems that she had a very kind of smug personality, and that comes out, I think, in the Pillow Book. Let me read you a quote that Murasaki Shikibu, what she wrote about Seishonagon. Seishonagon has the most extraordinary air of self-satisfaction. Yet if we stop to examine those Chinese writings of hers that she so pretentiously scatters about the place, we find they're full of imperfections. Someone who makes such an effort to be different from others is bound to fall in people's esteem, and I can only think her future will be a hard one. She's a gifted woman, to be sure, yet if one gives free rein to one's emotions, even under the most inappropriate circumstances, if one has to sample each interesting thing that comes along, people are bound to regard one as frivolous. And how can things turn out well for such a woman? And I think what we see here in Murasaki Shikibu's reaction to Seishonagon, her dismissal of her writings, which are not Chinese, they're Japanese, but has a kind of a style that maybe she strikes her as being Chinese. Her reaction to her is one that a lot of people have, because Seishonagon has one virtue that trumps every other, and that is beauty. For Seishonagon, beauty is the most important thing. So very often when we, like Murasaki Shikibu, look at her, we see her as being interested in giving free rein to her emotions and being interested in everything being beautiful at the expense of everything else. And ironically, this is the very same thing, I think, that makes the Pillow Book so beautiful, because all morality, all ethics, she doesn't like the poor. Why doesn't she like the poor? Because they're ugly, because they're dirty, because they're unfashionable. Let's read in the list, or in the section called "A Preacher Ought to Be Good Looking." A preacher ought to be good looking. For if we are properly to understand his worthy sentiments, we must keep our eyes on him while he speaks. Should we look away, we may forget to listen. Accordingly, an ugly preacher may well be the source of sin. But I must really stop writing this kind of thing. If I were still young enough, I might risk the consequence of putting down such impieties. But at my present age, the stage of life, I should be less flippant. And of course, she goes on from there. But I want you to note here that even the gods themselves, even the idea of the teachings of the preacher, are less important than how he looks when he does it. And as you read through the Pillow Book, you'll see where she talks about how to deal with a lover, or other elements of her life in court. The most important thing is always beauty. Let me also point out to you that she's a sneaky writer. Let me read this to you again. And I want you to pay attention to where she plays a little trick on us. A preacher ought to be good looking, For if we're to properly understand his worthy sentiments, we must keep our eyes on him while he speaks. Should we look away when we forget to listen? Accordingly, an ugly preacher may well be the source of sin. But I must really stop writing this kind of thing. If I were still young enough, I might risk the consequence of putting down such impieties, but at my present stage of life, I should be less flippant. She kind of acts like she's taking it back. She says, well, I shouldn't write this. I'm not going to write this. I'm too old to be writing something like this. But in fact, she has written it. She didn't erase it. She didn't tear it out. She didn't cross it out. She wrote it, and then she acts like she's taking it back. But of course, she's not taking it back at all. Seishonagon, as one student once said to me, is the kind of woman that you want to be sitting next to at the party because she will be eviscerating everyone else around you as long as she doesn't turn her attentions toward you. Now then, let's talk a little bit about your prompt for this week. Your prompt reads this: much of the pillow book are a series of lists. Think about why Seishonagon's lists are literary, while, for example, your grocery list is not. Then make your own literary list and post it here. So this time, your writing prompt is, in fact, a creative writing assignment. And one of the things that makes Seishonagon's lists literary is they're not just a grocery list or a laundry list. Instead, they have what we would call a lyrical quality. A lyrical quality. And lyrical writing, lyrical form, is marked by imagination, melody, emotion, and subjectivity. And what we mean by subjectivity, in a sense, is the way that you put yourself into that position. So, for example, let's look at one small list of hers. Elegant things. And I want you to listen to this. And in fact, rather than reading this aloud to yourself at this point, what I'd like you to do is simply close your eyes and envision this. Elegant things. A white coat worn over a violet waistcoat. Duck eggs. Shaved ice mixed with Liana syrup and put in a new silver bowl. A rosary of rock crystal. Wisteria blossoms. Plum blossoms covered with snow. A pretty child eating strawberries. Obviously, there is imagination, there's melody, there's emotion in this. And I think one of the hardest parts for us to understand is the subjectivity. And what I like about this is a pretty child eating strawberries. When I read that line, you have in your mind an image. You were imagining a particular child, a particular look of a child. And I'm guessing that that child is someone who maybe is not a child that you know, in some cases it will be, but instead is probably a little girl. She is probably maybe around the ages of 3 to 5. She's probably not Japanese unless you're Japanese. In other words, you're drawing in images from your own experiences and it places you into that, and a good list will do that. So, try to make sure that when you are writing your list that you appeal to imagination, melody, emotion, and subjectivity, and create a single unified impression. It's very important that your list have a single unified impression, such as this one, in which the unified impression is elegant things.